You ready, Mike?
Sounds good.
Okay. Let me get myself in the frame here. There we go. So I want to welcome everyone for coming tonight and say my name is Amy Janess. I'm programming coordinator at the Atheneum, and I'm joined by Janet Forrest, who's also here, my colleague in programming at the Atheneum. So tonight, we're really excited to welcome Michael Tougias, who has spoken for us a number of times. We haven't seen him in a little while, but it's always good to have him back. Mike's going to do his presentation, and then we'll take questions at the end. So at any point, if you think of a question you'd like to ask, put it in the Q&A, which you'll notice at the bottom of your screen. There's the Q&A button, and if you click on that, there's a place to type your question. So feel free to put questions in there as we go along or at the end, and then Janet and I will pop back in and read the questions off for Mike. And I'm just going to say a couple of words by way of introduction, and then we'll start. So Michael Tougias is a New York Times best-selling author or co-author of 30 books for adults and 7 for children and young adults. Among his bestsellers are The Finest Hours, which was turned into a Disney Motion Pictures film and opened in 2016 in 45 countries. Also Fatal Forecast, Overboard, King Philip's War, and my favorite, There's a Porcupine in My Outhouse, The Vermont Misadventures of a Mountain Man Wannabe. Michael lectures across the country on each of his book topics, but he also offers leadership and inspirational programs for business groups and has spoken to companies and organizations such as General Dynamics, Raytheon, Massachusetts School Library Association, and the New York University Surgeons Roundtable. So please join me in welcoming Mike Tougias. And
thank you, Amy.
Take it away.
Good to be back, and thank you, Janet. I'll give you folks a little bit about my career as a writer. I didn't set out to be a writer. I was a business major, and my first article was a fishing article, and that little light bulb went off in my head because it just felt so good to have that story published. So my early books were about the outdoors. I did a book about Quabbin Reservoir, exploring it and the construction of it, and travelogues. But then I found a great story of survival at sea, which became 10 Hours Until Dawn. It occurred during the blizzard of 1978. And that launched me on a whole new path. And I did a bunch of books along that line, leading to the Finest Hours. And that was the real lucky break. Any author that tells you, oh, my book was so great, it became a movie, it's luck. Let me tell you, the stars have to align perfectly. And that's what happened with The Finest Hours. So that was nice. Then my career took an unexpected turn where a publisher approached me about adapting a couple of my books for middle readers, which would be 8 to 14. And I've now got 4 out. It's called the True Rescue series, with 3 more on the way. And that's been really rewarding. It's so much fun to get emails from kids. And it's nice, a lot of times I'll get emails from librarians as well saying, oh, your book, I recommend it for reluctant readers. And I say, that's because I made it that way. You know, my mantra for both adults and for kids is make it fast paced. That's my one mantra when I'm writing. And then have a brand new book out I'll tell you a little bit about at the end of the program. Just came out 2 weeks ago. A great book for Father's Day because it's a father-son story, a memoir. And tonight's story is about a little piece of history that not many people are familiar with, and I was never taught it in high school. And what I want to do to tell the story is use some slides. So while I don't give the whole book away, I want to whet your appetite. So I hope you'll read it and take you through a part of history, and hopefully you'll get a nice overview of history. And I'm going to share my screen here. This is a co-written book with Allison O'Leary. And by the way, at the end, I'll show my website. It's just michaeltougias.com. But in my zeal, when the book came out, I ordered 1,000 copies, many of which are still in my garage. So on my website, I offer this at half price. And there's a way for me to personalize it, you to let me know if you want to give it as a gift, who you want me to make it out to. But what drew us both to this story was we had not come across another book that focuses on an American family's fight for survival in World War II, in combat. I know there's a couple stories about American families caught up in Europe, but none here at home, because this occurred right off our coastline. So I'm going to introduce you to the main characters. The slides are in 3 sections, structured similar to the book, part 1, 2, and 3. And we will be off and running. So part 1, I want to introduce you to 2 of the main characters and their children. Sonny Downs and his sister Lucille. So Sonny was 8 years old, Lucille was 11, and Sonny is now, he must be about 85, living in Quincy, Mass. So yet another reason I did the book, because I had an eyewitness local who could tell a lot of the story and had some documents that nobody else had. His parents, Ray and Ina, and they were all from Texas, and they were working down in Colombia, South America, for United Fruit. It was a kind of a poor family, and this was finally a good job with a good pay. But, Ray was a real patriot, and he wanted to get home when World War II broke out and join the Marines. But he couldn't get passage until May of 1942. So the war started in December of 41. It wasn't until May of 1942 that they got room on this ship called the Heredia. I think the next slide, there it is. So this was a United Fruit ship, and most of the people on board were United Fruit employees, a couple armed guards, but this was really the only family. And I'm an ocean guy. I'm always out there fishing for striped bass or bluefish or whatever. And we boaters know that it's bad luck to bring a banana on a boat. And in this case, this ship was loaded with bananas because it's United Fruit, and they're bringing the bananas and coffee back from South America to a port, which was New Orleans. They did not know, those people on board the ship, nor did our authorities for that matter at this particular time, that the larger class of U-boats, they're called Class 9, were large enough, with a large enough fuel capacity to go all the way from Europe across the Atlantic, go around the tip of Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico. So they would have probably had not done this voyage had they known that a U-boat could reach the Gulf of Mexico. And these U-boats were so large that they could even do a 2-week patrol in the Gulf before they had to head back. And if they wanted to extend it, there was even a way to refuel at secret locations from these U-boats converted to just carrying fuel and extra torpedoes that were called the milk cows. So here's a look inside the U-boat. This is one that's at the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. Many years ago, I went inside, and while this view looks spacious, trust me, it's not. It's not a place if you're claustrophobic. And they would pack 55 German sailors on board. So it was crowded condition, and just one head for all 55 men. In 505 that you see, that it's the only U-boat we have in America that people can tour. The U-boat that we're going to follow is 506. So it was the sister ship. It looked exactly like this one And so U-506 was the first vessel to enter the Gulf. And its commander was quite young, 29-year-old Eric Verdeman that you see in this slide. And he was accompanied by one other U-boat, which was 507. And that was by Harrow Schatz was the commander. Harrow Schatz was really an interesting guy because he was daring, he was colorful. There was one instance where he sank a ship off Miami and the people were in the life raft, and all of a sudden his U-507 pops up and they all think they're going to be shot. And he comes up to the conning tower and goes, sorry about that. You have Roosevelt to blame for this. Here's some cake. He gives him a cake from France and gives him some water and points which way land is. So Eric Verdeman was a little different, more cautious and by the book, but both were competing to see how many ships they could sink because we were so ill prepared here in the US. In fact, the U-boat commanders called this the second happy time. In other words, that the hunting was so good. So a big break when Allison and I were researching this story was actually finding what's called the war diary, or the KTB, of both Verdeman and Schatz. And of all places, they were at the National Archives here in the US, not over in Germany. And nobody had ever looked at them. They were still in German, never been translated. So we were able to make photocopies and have it translated. And boy, that opened things up. We could follow particularly Verdeman and what his whole career was like in the war right up to the moment of his death. And he's going to be the commander that attacks Sonny and Lucille's and Ray and Ina, the ship there on the Heredia. So it had all these things in the war diary, and just a miracle they survived. And they were part of Operation Drumbeat, which was, you know, you're not coming to the US just to sink, say, military ships or oil tankers. It's any US ship. You're going to be graded, I'm using that term liberally, based on how much tonnage you sank. And they wanted to do this quick before the US got their act together. And look at that bottom bullet. In the first 4 months, they sank 170 ships that were in US controlled waters. And guess how many U-boats we sank? One. So 1 versus 170. And maybe that's why they didn't teach it to me in high school, because it was something the historians wanted to sweep under the rug, didn't make the US look too good. So the mastermind behind this operation to come to America once the US got involved in the war was Admiral Karl Dönitz, who you see here. And his philosophy was, let's catch them while we can before they get their act together. I think had Hitler listened to him, the course of the war in England might have gone differently, because in this picture, there's Dönitz and Hitler, but Hitler thought he was smarter than everybody else, and he refused to listen to Dönitz's idea that we should put every U-boat we have on the offensive because we have the upper hand. They're not detecting us. We're sinking ships left and right. But Hitler refused, and he always held back a large percent in a defensive purpose, particularly in the North Sea. So you wonder if Dönitz was, allowed to do what he wanted, what might have happened to the UK. Because Churchill's famous for one quote. He said, "The thing I feared most in World War II was what the U-boats could do to us." So the U-boats weren't coming from Germany and attacking the US. They were coming from bases in occupied France. And the big base was in Lorient, France, and that's where these U-boat pens, this photo was taken. Churchill again in his diary, said, "Oh, we've bombed the U-boat pens in Lorient to think we've done real damage." And then in Dernitz's memoir, he says they bombed the hell out of our pens and did absolutely no damage because they were so thick with reinforced concrete. And when they returned from their initial attacks on the US, they were treated like conquering heroes because they were so successful. Big parties and dinners. And I recently watched Das Boot again, and I've come to the conclusion that movie is very accurate of everything that went on involving U-boats. So if you get a chance, it is accurate. So those are the characters that, whenever I do a book, my method is don't introduce a whole bunch of characters, because you're going to either confuse the reader or you're going to kind of divide the reader's interest. I'd rather just have a small handful that you really get to know and you really get to care about, particularly the Downs family. And even to some extent, Eric Verdeman. Some people have said, "How dare you write tell the Nazi side of it?" Well, if you were a 29-year-old, you could either join the Nazi party or join no party. And from everything I saw, he didn't join the Nazi party. But a young man, you just serve your country. You've been brought up that way, up through the system. So I didn't see too much different from Eric Verdeman joining the military than other men around the world. So Verdeman has now got his U-boat into the Gulf of Mexico. He sunk a couple ships already off Florida, and he's heading towards New Orleans, where he knows there'll be oil tankers coming out down the Mississippi River. And these are just some of the ships when he gets towards New Orleans that he either sinks or damages. And then if I were to put the other U-boat, Harrow Schatz, that he was on, you'd have double this number. So they're in competition. Schatz even went right to the mouth of the Mississippi River and parked himself on the bottom. And in his war diary, he said, "I'm in very shallow water, but the water's kind of a yellowish brown color, and I don't think they can see me on the bottom." And when he fires on a ship, they had a lot of torpedoes that were kind of duds. They called them circlers. They kind of went in an arc rather than straight. And he blew up part of the jetty, missed the ship and blew up the jetty. But that's how deep into our territory they came. And usually a U-boat would attack at night, because you wouldn't want to be caught on the surface in a U-boat for enemy aircraft to see you. But they found we were so ill prepared, they could do it in broad daylight, and they did. And we were trying to track both our own shipping and U-boats. This is the Gulf Sea Frontier Control Room, but largely ineffective. Admiral King was in charge of all this. I was never a big fan of his. Some people say, well, it wasn't all his fault because we sent so much of our naval resources to the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, and that's true as well. But we did have one effective means of finding and bombing U-boats, and that was the Liberator. But Verdeman wrote in his diary, we were attacked by a Liberator, but their aim is terrible. They're dropping the bombs way too far away to do us any harm, and we would die. So in this photo, if you look carefully up on the conning tower, there are a couple men. So they would have shouted, "Dive, dive, alarm, alarm." And then they kind of have an old-fashioned system, by the way, even though the U-boat was quite sophisticated, to help it get down, as every available man would run to the bow for extra weight, and they go down bow first, and then they'd be safe. So if you were in a Liberator, you had to drop that bomb pretty darn close to fracture the hull. Sonny and Lucille, they're on the Heredia coming back towards New Orleans. They have no idea about U-boats, nor do their parents, because again, the U-boats entered the Gulf at the very same time that the Heredia is entering the Gulf. So in this map, you see the Heredia's voyage. Now, they were supposed to go straight north to New Orleans, but someone on board the Heredia saw something suspicious in the distance. And from all my research, I'm sure the captain was aware of U-boats because he could receive incoming radio messages. He just wasn't allowed to broadcast. So if somebody reported something suspicious in the water, he probably thought it was a U-boat. So he went to the closest port, which was Corpus Christi. And by now, Ina, the mom, is starting to put two and two together. Maybe the U-boats are in the Gulf. And when she gets to Corpus Christi, she says, let us off here. It's closer to our home up in San Antonio. And he says, I'll see what I can do. And he goes ashore and he comes back and he tells her bad news. Not only are you not allowed to get off the ship, none of us can stay here. We have to go to New Orleans. And she's got that woman's intuition and is begging to get off. And he's going, no, when you wake up in the morning, we're going to leave now, evening. When you wake up in the morning, we'll be at the dock in New Orleans. So it's going to be 12 hours, but it doesn't work out that way. Verdeman in his diary said, we could see the silhouette coming. And he said, we didn't even have to move. It was coming right at us. So he was able to just stay in one place at night on the surface and wait for this big ship to come by and fire their torpedoes almost point blank. And Sonny, he said at first, when the ship shuddered, he thought they were at the dock in New Orleans, that, they hit the dock. But he said, then the lights came on, then they flickered off. And then his father is throwing his life jacket on him. And his father goes, wait here. I'm going to get your mother and sister in the next cabin. And Sonny said, that's when I could see water coming into our berth. So what I want to do now is tell you there's basically 4 survival stories that we focus on, the 4 different family members, because when the first torpedo hits, the family is all together. They got their life vests on. They're going to go up to the lifeboats, and they're going up this big mahogany staircase. This was a converted passenger ship, the Heredia. And they get to the top step when the second torpedo hits, which blows all 4 of them in different directions, which is terrible for the family. But for a writer, I was like, oh, perfect. I've got 4 different survival stories. And finally, 2 stories about heroic females, because in the past, most of the survivors I've written about are males. So I want to tell the story of Ina that you see here. So she gets blown right off the ship, whereas other family members were not. And the current, and again, this is occurring, let's see, at 2 a.m. The current carries her far from the ship. She's shouting for the kids and no answers are coming. And she's covered in oil. She makes it alive until dawn. And about maybe 9 a.m., she does see, not too far away, 2 sailors on board a big piece of wood. It must have been a board that came off the Heredia. And, she's getting hypothermic and she's got to get out of the water. So she swims over, and one of the guys must have been caught, asleep when the torpedoes hit, because he's naked and he slides off into the water. She gets up on the board and she goes to him, this is no time for modesty. This is life and death. Get up here. And he goes, no, ma'am, I'm going to stay right here. So if you can picture, he's hanging on like this. And by the way, a lot of the reason we know so much of Ina's story is she left an incredible audio recording of what happened to her. took us months to locate it, but we did find it at a distant relative of hers. So she's sitting on the board, just trying to survive, and of course freezing because it's May. And this guy she sees in the water is turning blue, and she figures, well, I'll call his bluff. I can't watch him die. So she goes, if you don't get up here, you're forcing me to leave because I can't watch you die. And he goes, no, ma'am, I'm not moving, and he's hanging on blue. And what does she do? She gets in the water and swims away. I mean, there's no way I would have done that. But she can't bear to watch this guy die. And in the audio recording, she also said, I held out hope that somehow I'd find my kids, which is so far-fetched, just swimming in the ocean, that you'd find them. So that swimming away from the board was not a good move, because now she's all alone again, totally on her own. And she said first she saw one fin coming and just kind of cruising in a circular way around her, and then another and another. And she said it got up to 5. And she was a deeply religious woman. She said, this is the first time in my life I swore. And one of the sharks actually finally came in. And in a lot of my survival stories that involve sharks, they won't attack right away. They'll bump you or bump the life raft kind of to find out what it is. And what might have saved her is at the last minute, she put on this long woolen coat that went all the way down past her knees. And so when that shark came in, she drew her legs up into the coat, and maybe instead of the shark, hitting flesh, felt that coarse wool, because she said a combination of that and my strong belief in God, that shark turned away. And then she said after about 20 minutes, all 5 sharks left. So she just, imagine alone like that. But now it's dark. And how is she ever going to be found? Authorities now know the Heredia has been sunk. But how are we going to find this one person way off so far from the wreckage? But believe it or not, a shrimp boat finds her. I don't know how. They had searchlights, so definitely an element of luck involved. But they did find her. So her time in the water was about 23 hours. And then I'll tell Lucille's survival story, but I'll leave out the key character who's Sonny, and I'll leave out the survival story of his dad. I will say that those two at some point do find each other. And one of the big tensions in the book is they also find the captain of the Heredia, and Sonny and the dad and the captain are all on one flimsy little balsa wood life raft. And the captain thinks, well, I'm the captain, so I'm in charge. And the dad's like, not anymore. You have no ship. I'm in charge of this life raft. And they get in all sorts of disagreements that it looks like it's going to ruin their chance of survival. And Sonny's just sitting there with wide eyes. He can't believe what he's seeing. But so that's kind of the key survival story, because I had Sonny to work with on it, his memories and his notes that he kept through the years. But Lucille's story is pretty interesting too, because she found herself at one end of the ship and barely hanging on. It was tilting. And then a sailor, thank God, saw her, and he said, we have to jump. The ship's going down and it's going to suck us with it. So on the count of 3, we're going to jump together. And his name, I think there's a picture, here he is, Roy Sorley. He's in the suit there, and then there he is on the right with that other sailor. He was one of the sailors on board the Heredia, and thank God he found Lucille, because several times he saves her life. They jump together off the ship. They find a it was a hatch, and he puts Lucille on the hatch in a sitting position. So if you can imagine, from her waist down is below water, but at least from her waist up, she's above water for, again, hypothermia. And he's doing everything he can to keep her spirits up because she's asking, obviously, about her father and mother and her brother. And he's encouraging her that they're going to make it. He's in the water and he's getting stung by jellyfish after jellyfish. Turned out he lived in Linfield, Mass. So when I called his family up, they obviously knew about this, but they didn't have too much information. They said, we just have that Mariner's medal that he was awarded. And I said, oh, wow, I got to send you photocopies because he and Lucille wrote letters to each other for many months after this whole ordeal. And they were plagued by sharks as well. And what happened was one of the sharks must have rubbed up, again, how I said, a lot of times they'll probe first. Well, it must have rubbed up against her feet and legs. And she doesn't know it's a shark. Sorley's in the water and she goes, Mr. Sorley, quit tickling my feet. He knows it's a shark because he can see it right down there. And he doesn't want to panic her. So he goes, well, I'll do it, every now and then I need to tickle your feet to keep you awake in case an airplane is looking for us. You need to wave that white rag. So it's very interesting. She never knew about the sharks that were plaguing them and following them below, but never did attack. He kept it from her until he wrote to her later. So he definitely saved her life in numerous instances in their survival ordeal. So I'm jumping ahead. So again, I'm leaving out the story. I always want the book to have surprises. I'm leaving out the story of the dad and Sonny the boy. But here you can see that they do make it. But it doesn't make the newspaper until May 25th because there was this time of censorship where they had to interview everybody before it could become public knowledge about what happened on board the ship. And I like that photo so much, I actually tracked down the original. And, you see all these great smiles because each one thinks the other family members have been lost at sea. And the fact that they all lived is amazing because most people on the Heredia perished. So just amazing all four made it. And the smile on the father quickly fades. And I think it was post-traumatic stress. But back then, you didn't have that term, but he becomes obsessed. He wants revenge against the Germans. He can't sleep nights. He ends up joining the Coast Guard to get the revenge and does probably the opposite of what the family needs. They need to go home and be with other family members. He uproots them and takes them right to St. Augustine, where he's stationed in the Coast Guard on patrol duty for submarines. So it doesn't have a neat, happy ending. It's a kind of an interesting story to follow. I do this in all my books. It's just one of my rules. Follow what happens afterwards to these individuals. How did this affect their lives and what happened to them later? But I also wanted to follow Vertiman because you're reading his diary and you're interested to see what happens. He did sink a couple more ships on the way back to Europe. And he gets a couple weeks off. He's awarded the Knight's Cross for his great mission. And then he's sent back out to sea again, and he becomes involved in one of the strangest incidents in World War II, the Laconia Incident. This was a British passenger ship that had been converted to bring some troops home, some civilians home, but a lot of Italian POWs as well, bringing them to England. And it was attacked by Commander Hartenstein on a U-boat. And this would be, like 700 miles off Africa. And Hartenstein hears people shouting for help in the water in Italian, and he knows, oh my God, I've sunk a ship with my allies on it. And so he gets permission from Admiral Darnitz to do a rescue. And Hartenstein says, I can't ask who's Italian or who's British. I just got to rescue everybody. And they give him permission. And the strangest thing is he puts out a radio message. Are there any other U-boats that can help? And he also says on open air, I'm declaring this a neutral area because I'm rescuing everybody. And 2 U-boats come to his aid. Who do you think they are? Eric Verdeman and Harrow Schatz, who have just done their mission in the Gulf of Mexico. And the women that were rescued said the Germans treated them really well, blankets and tea, and they would have perished had they not been rescued. And this is a shot of Eric Verdeman's sub. Look at how loaded it is with survivors, anything to get them out of the water where it's hypothermia and sharks. And then I mentioned this is a strange tale. Here's the even stranger part. For some reason, an American liberator comes, sees that this rescue is going on, sees that they've even painted a red cross on a white sheet, and asks his base, what should I do? I see this U-boat. He doesn't mention the other 2. They're a little bit in the distance. And his orders come back, bomb it. It's unbelievable. And why they did it is just the fog of war. It's an American plane. We must have thought, no matter what the situation is with rescue or not, it's a chance to sink a U-boat. So that liberator drops a bomb. It actually hits one of the lifeboats that the people are in rather than the sub. And Hartenstein has to dive, and everybody's swept off. He tells them, get off, I'm diving. We're being bombed. So it's just a strange, strange incident. And again, that's in the final third of the book, and we go into what happens to both the 3 subs and the many survivors. So now on Verdeman's 4th patrol in that war diary, he says, we only sank 2 ships, and he's been on patrol 143 days at sea. That's a long time to be on one of those stinking U-boats. And we've gotten so much better with detecting U-boats. We have sonar, we have radar that can pierce cloud cover. We're using blimps to try and spot them. We're traveling in convoys. The liberators have learned to swoop down out of the sun so they don't see you coming to the end and drop those bombs close. And then here's another way that I knew so close to home was meant to be. We actually know what happened to Eric Verdeman right up to his last words. And usually that's unheard of because the U-boat sinks with all hands on board, like that submarine that just sank in Indonesia last week. We'll never know what happened. But in this case, we do. A liberator sees U-506 on the surface. They had some mechanical issues, so they had to surface. And they come charging out of the sun. They're off of Portugal when this happens. And this is the actual shot taken from the plane of the direct hit on Eric Verdeman's U-boat. And interestingly, Verdeman and 5 others were in the conning tower when it was bombed, so they're blown into the ocean rather than trapped in the sub that goes to the bottom of the sea. So here's another shot. In this one, you see the oil slick there, you see these dark blobs. Those are some of the surviving German sailors, and 2 of them are holding up Eric Verdeman, who's injured. And, the waves are slapping him in the face. And after a couple hours, Verdeman realizes these two men are struggling, and he just says, "Let me go, let me go," and they do, and he sinks, and that's his last words. And the reason we know that is those two men who were holding him up were rescued by the British. And at the British National Archives, we have the interrogation report of the interrogation of these two men, and they described how, the sub had mechanical difficulties, had to be on the surface, was surprised by the Liberator, how they held up Ferdinand, and then his last words. So that's when I knew, boy, this was one of those books meant to be, because of my 37 books. I've got an equal number that are half finished in the attic that'll never see the light of day, because you just don't get that feeling that it's all coming together and is going to be the fast-paced read I want it to be. So if you're interested in So Close to Home, it is half price on the website, and when you order it, there's a place for me to personalize it if you're giving it a gift. And also on the website, I was going to mention the brand new book. It's called The Waters Between Us, and this is it's an interesting format, because the first half of the book is kind of like Bill Bryson's A Walk in the Woods, all these misadventures I got into when I was young. They're all taking place in the outdoors. And this difficult relationship I had with my father, but then the book takes a more serious turn when a family tragedy hits, and I see my father's response, which was incredible. And he kept at it for years. It drew us together. So it's a really inspiring book of how two people can come together. And a big part of it for me was, after that family tragedy, I spent more time than ever in the outdoors, and I found it to be the way to heal. I found I was kind of going off the rails, but getting back in the woods, how I grew up, was very helpful. So that would be an interesting Father's Day or Mother's Day gift. And whoops. And so in the epilogue, going back to So Close to Home, remember I say I follow the characters. So I mentioned about Sonny's dad, the post-traumatic stress, what happens to the family I get into, but also I was very interested in Sonny, and that little boy grows up to be 6 feet 5 inches and becomes the all-time leading scorer at Texas University. And he actually got drafted into the NBA, and he said he played Bill Russell in college. And I said, "What was that like?" And he said, "Man," he said, "I could shoot both lefty and righty, and that's why I was such a scoring threat." But he said, "Bill Russell was the only person in midair could switch and block my other hand if I switched to shoot with my left." But it was interesting. He said, "I was making more money selling insurance to other players than I was with an NBA salary." So he decided to leave and become a salesman. And, so the salaries back then were nothing like the salaries today in the NBA. But he was quite an athlete, and he's doing just fine in Quincy, Mass. Here he is. He's still working. He's a financial analyst and financial sales, and just very eloquent. And again, that's how you know the story's right, when kind of your lead person that you're going to be interviewing is so easy to work with and so accommodating. Again, some stories I backed away from because the person just couldn't open up. Whereas like with The Finest Hours with Bernie Weber, he didn't want to open up. He didn't even want to do the book in the beginning, but I kept working on him and finally got him to give in. Later, his daughter told me the secret of why he agreed to do the book. But he's just had a wonderful life, and he was Sonny was just so happy to see this book come out, because he said for years, people didn't believe me that this happened. like you survived a U-boat attack. And so that's one of the books so close to home. There is a version for middle readers, age 8 to 14, but we changed the title so there wouldn't be confusion. So the young adult version is called Attacked at Sea. The adult version is So Close to Home. And now we can open it up to questions or comments. I'll stop sharing my screen here. Bear with me. And we can talk about whatever you want. It doesn't have to be about So Close to Home or the U-boats. It can be on writing or the other books or projects you might be working on. I love questions, so I'm fine with any and all.
Have you gotten any nibbles from film people for So Close to Home? It sounds very cinematic.
It does to me too. And of course, every author thinks that of every one of their books, but one of the actors in The Finest Hours is pitching it. No bites yet, but he said everything's kind of messed up because of the pandemic. So there's a shot. I think it's a very long shot knowing how Hollywood works, but you never know. You never know. I like it because you have Ina, the strong female character, and what she does to keep it together. So there's, to me, that's a strong appeal for a story.
Mm-hmm.
What was the most rewarding part of watching your film get translated onto the screen?
Wow, that's a great question, because there were a lot of moments. I think because Disney was very inclusive and would invite the co-author and I to the set. I could bring my kids. Just the involvement from day one in knowing what was going on. So I never felt like I was out of the loop. Now, as the author, once you sign away the rights, you don't have any control of the movie making. So there were parts in the movie I wanted to go, cut, but you can't. I did have a little input into the screenplay, so I figured, well, that's better than most. So there's a couple scenes in the movie that I wrote, one of which is where Bernie's fiance is shining the headlights out to sea. So yeah, the whole experience was fantastic. That's how I would label it. How long did it take you to write each book? Normally, it's about 18 months. So Close to Home, I'd say, was 18 months, because it's like, get Ray, his real name is Ray Sunny Downs. Get him over here for dinner. Let's get this thing going. This is fantastic. Whereas The Finest Hours, for example, Bernie was very reluctant, and he kept telling me, he's the hero, by the way, Bernie Weber. He kept saying, nobody's going to read this book. And he was starting to convince me that nobody was. So I really was kind of taking a long time on that book. I wasn't like locked in 100%. So that book took years of research. And the research was difficult because many of the people in that book the survivors had passed away. So I had to track down family members to see what they wrote about their experience. So whereas So Close to Home, Vertiman's diary right at the National Archives, what a lucky break. Yeah.
So Robert asked a question. Did you ever learn anything about U-boats in and around Nantucket?
I know they were here, and all the way up the Maine coast. I'm not a U-boat expert. I know that 2 U-boats did drop off saboteurs, and they were caught. One was kind of funny. The U-boat came right to shore on Long Island and dropped off the men, but stayed there a little too long, and the tide went out. So now the U-boat's stuck, and nobody saw it. And they let the tide come back up, and they got out of there. So, but yeah, there were U-boats everywhere, and they were sinking ships left and right. The ocean floor is just littered with the ships that they sank in the early days. I did see a question briefly about Hartigan, and I think He's the U-boat commander that wrote a great book called Iron Coffin. It's a real tomb of a book. But he later settled in the U.S., one of the few U-boat commanders that did survive.
Let's see. Here's a question that says, one of your maps had a green marker on Nova Scotia. Were U-boats in action there?
They were up there. Yep. And they were everywhere because one of Verdeman's patrols was all the way to the tip of South Africa and back again. And he said, I only sank 2 ships. All that travel to just sink 2 ships isn't very effective. But he knows, what's interesting is he knows that things are not looking good for his lifespan, because in the book I write about how Harrow Schatz died, and that was one of his good friends. So, you know, the fact that he stayed with it just shows their dedication in the German Navy. In the Nuremberg trials, the Admiral Dönitz was not hung as some other Nazi leaders were, and part of it was because he showed compassion during that Laconia incident, and some American naval people said he conducted warfare no different than we would have. He did not allow his men to shoot survivors in the water. The Japanese did that all the time. Imperial Japan did that if they sank a U.S. ship. Speaking of U-boats and the Japanese, one of the next books in this True Rescue series for kids is an adaptation I did of In Harm's Way that another author wrote about the battleship Indianapolis that was sunk at the tail end of the war by a Japanese sub. That's kind of a widely known story, but I don't think there's a book about it for kids.
Let's see, we have a question. Actually, this is interesting. We talked about this before we got on the call. How do you work with a co-author, and how do you decide which parts each author focuses on?
Well, the good news was with So Close to Home, Allison is my partner, so that was easy. I said, I have a great story if you want to do it. And she was like, absolutely. And so we just, parcel out research. Like, she's the one who went to the National Archives when we got the tip that maybe the war diary was there. Another co-author, for example, with Rescue of the Bounty, he's a very accomplished sailor, and I'm not. And I'm very familiar with how Coast Guards do air rescues with the rescue swimmers. And I said, why don't you write about the Bounty going out and what's going on in nautical terms up to, and into the storm, and I'll write the rescue part. So we basically kind of split the book in half and then looked over each other's half. But it was interesting on that one. That's going to become a kid's book as well. And he just said, "This is harder than the adult book. I'm fine with you doing it." And so I'm like, I've done a few, so I kind of get the hang of it. People say I'm a 10-year-old trapped in a 65-year-old's body. Which could be true, because I just blew out my hamstring doing a 50-yard dash against my daughter. Yeah, you'll see. I posted it on my Facebook page, my author page. I beat her, but then I fall into a heap. Now I'm in deep trouble.
Okay, so we have a question here that says, when writing stories, do you find them or do they find you?
It's a combination of both. The story of So Close to Home has kind of a neat way it found me. I was doing one of my talks, and it was at John Hancock, and it was about what I learned from survivors of how to make good decisions when you're under a lot of pressure, because these survivors have to make good decisions or they wouldn't have survived. So one of their lead attorney, Jim Hoodlet, and I had breakfast and we hit it off. And he said, why don't you come? We're both fishermen. Let's go out striper fishing. So I was on his boat and he started to tell me the story about Sonny. And well, I was hooked. He knew Sonny. He was a friend of Sonny's. And so when the book came out, we gave Jim this giant, hook on a little pedestal saying, you sure hooked Mike going out on that boat on that fishing day. I dropped everything else I was doing because I said, this is a great story. So that one found me.
There's a comment in the chat I just wanted to read. It says, during Operation Drumbeat, I thought it was fascinating the action of the U-123 Captain Reinhard Hartigan bringing the bow of his boat onto the sand by Coney Island so his crew could observe the skyline of New York City in January 1942. Hartigan died at 105.
Wow. Yeah, I knew. And Hartigan retired here in the US. I would have loved to have interviewed him, but it was too late. I didn't know. But yeah, I think it was Iron Coffins is the name of Hartigan's book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And then we had one more, another question in the chat. How many books are you working on simultaneously?
I find it best to do one at a time, but I don't always follow that rule because sometimes it's scheduling. So oftentimes it's two. I might be writing one and already moving to the research of the next one. And people always say, oh, you love to write because you're prolific. I go, no, I don't. I'm hooked on the research. But then I figure I've done all this research. I got to do the writing now. But yeah, I love the research.
Okay, and we have a comment here. It's not really a question, but Robert says, my father's girlfriend was not allowed to come to Nantucket in the early years of the war due to her family's fear of U-boats.
That makes sense. I would have second thoughts myself in the early years. Yep. In the later, towards the close of the war, there weren't too many U-boats off our coast. But the early years, yeah, it was happy hunting is what they said.
Well, I'm so glad that you kind of brought this chapter of American history back into our consciousness, because it definitely feels like it drifted away for a while.
Yeah, those are the stories I love. That's why, I did 2 books on King Philip's War, one with Eric Schultz, because I thought nobody knows about this big Indian War that so many casualties happened. And yeah, those are the stories I love, the ones that get overlooked.
All right. Well, do you have any final words of wisdom for us tonight before we wrap up?
No, I thank you all. If you want to see an interview with Sonny telling the moment the torpedo hit the ship and how his father had to wake him up, it's on my website. And I just let him talk. So it's like a 5-minute clip of Sonny telling the story.
Great. All right.
Okay.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming, and I want to thank Michael for coming to us tonight. And I hope we'll see you again.
And thank you, Janet and Amy, for setting this all up. I appreciate the hard work, and hopefully we'll see you in person next time.
Yeah, take it easy, Mike. What a pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
How do you turn off the streaming?
Ooh, hold on. I'll cut this part. There we go.
What did you do?